Thank you very much to everybody. It is my privilege, Dr. Russ Glenn from the United States Army TRADOC, to welcome you all to what promises to be 2 magnificent days based on the speaker slate that we have. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the United States Army Pacific, United States Army Japan, the Australian Army, my own organization, United States Army Training and Doctrine Command, and of course, those from the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force who have provided this most magnificent facility and so much support. I'll go through a few minutes of administrative information, and then we will get right into the more interesting portion of our first of 2 days. You can see the slides up there. I will hit the points very lightly, and we'll move on. Should there be a need to evacuate the building, the stairwells are in the aisle, not when you go out this door, but that parallels it toward your right rear. If you decide to exit through this door, I would advise that you not take the first right that crosses to the other hallway, but rather the second right that goes in front of the elevators. Walk by the elevators, turn right, and the first door on the right is a stairwell. If you exit out the back doors, please turn left, go down the steps, turn left again by the tables where you registered, and the exit is immediately to your front in that wall. So 2 stairwells is all we have to exit the building, and if we follow that procedure, then we'll avoid to some extent having one become too busy. Restrooms, as you may have found out already, are also to your right rear. That for the males is in that hallway that parallels this, and the women's is in the cross hallway, the shorter cross hallway. Do note, please, that all meals, other than those hosted for the speakers, are no host. In other words, for coffee and for meals, you will pay your own way. You can find one of many escorts to get over to the lunch session where they have some excellent bento box and other offerings. I can attest from having sampled them yesterday. From the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force, anybody with a purple arm sleeve band can assist you with any questions you might have or escort duties, as well as can, from USERJ, USERPAC, and TRADOC, individuals who are to the left rear of this room, Mark Kreutzer, Mark, thank you, or myself, or others who will step forward. So please do not hesitate should you have a question. You all have your packets in front of you. We will not introduce each speaker with the exception of our keynote speaker in order to get maximum time from each one of our speakers and also for your Q&A during the panel sessions. There will be no questions asked during the speakers' 30 minutes, but rather all questions will be asked, please, during the panel sessions where all of the speakers in the session are on the front stage. Colonel Scott, who is listed on the slide, unfortunately had a family emergency. He will not be able to be here and regrets that. He is the United States Army Pacific's liaison officer to the headquarters for Ground Defense Force and had a key role in making this conference a success that I'm sure that it will be. For speakers, in order to help you determine where you are in your 30-minute period, we will have somebody in the back of the room hold up a sign when you have 10 minutes remaining, 5 minutes remaining, 1 minute remaining, and when your time has run out. This event will be recorded, and it will be made available both to the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force in Japanese and to the Americans and other partners in English. The only exception to that will be the not be posted on the internet, as will the remaining sessions, the 2 today and tomorrow afternoon. I encourage you, as we did in New York for our first conference a little over a year ago that dealt with multi-domain battle, now multi-domain operations in megacities, to not feel that you should sit with somebody with whom you are familiar. Please feel free to mix it up, find somebody that you don't know, sit next to him or her, and exchange information, exchange ideas. Another part of all this is we're very fortunate to have you in the audience. But it is those recordings, and it will be the written proceedings that will capture many of the points and allow them to be distributed far wider than we can do ourselves here as audience members. So please, my email is at the top of your agenda. Either during the event, and I say that we don't have internet here, but during the event period of the next couple of days, or in the 2 to 3 weeks after, if you have an observation, a recommendation, an experience that would lend us to better get across ideas and concepts that we discuss here as we are interested in current and future operations in megacities, send those to me. I will capture them and certainly include them. One such example we were discussing earlier was a gentleman who was up in Hokkaido during a recent earthquake. And he talked about how one of the lessons that he learned right off the bat was that you always need to have some significant cash, because obviously if you lose electricity and power, then your credit card is of no value. That's of less importance to our Japanese partners because they are generally a cash economy, but if you were here as a tourist, for example, in the 2020 Summer Olympics and had no cash, it could be a significant detriment. Next slide, thank you. Please do remember to turn your badges in every day. They will be given back out in subsequent days. If you leave early, in other words, before the end of the conference, turn your badge at the registration desks, which are to your right rear out the doors. Otherwise, please take the badge with you down to the first floor, and as you exit the building, a member of the GSO will take your badge from you. There is no food in the auditorium. I'm looking around to see if anybody's sneaking it off their table. It doesn't look like it. And you are welcome to have drinks as long as there is a lid on it. Please, no open top drinks, but if it's, for example, a Starbucks coffee that has a lid or a bottle that you have a screw top on, that's perfectly acceptable. When we do get to the panel sessions, we ask that you wait until the microphone comes to you. That way, not only can the translators hear what you have to say, and so therefore we can share it with all audience members, but also we capture it for those recordings that will be posted. The headsets, I believe, are self-explanatory. The power button is in the middle. The volume is to your right. Everybody will be on channel 1, whether Japanese or English. That is the button to the left-hand side. It should be set for channel 1 right now. If you have any difficulties with your headset, do not hesitate to exit out the back doors and turn left, and somebody at one of the 2 registration tables will assist you. In the restrooms, if you would be so kind as to not use the trash bins for anything other than the paper towels, if we have mixed trash there, then somebody needs to go through it and separate out what is not paper towels. So please, if you have your plastic bottles or whatever, take them with you and dispose of them after you depart the building, or when you go over to lunch. And if there's anybody who has not checked in yet, please do so at the first break with the tables, and again, to your left rear, or right rear, I'm sorry. Next slide, please. Just a reminder, our focus for this 2 days is on the operational and the strategic rather than the tactical levels. So higher level concerns with regard to current and future operations in megacities. We will certainly have some valuable tactical experiences that are used by our speakers to relate. If our individuals who are asking questions would like to relate to a tactical example, fine. But the overall focus is the operational and strategic levels as we look at those conference objectives posted on the slide. And ultimately, of course, as should be evident already, this is about partnership, about learning together. Next slide, thank you. Just some definitions of both strategic, and operational levels of war. Next slide, please. I've already hit that first point, but I would like to re-emphasize it. please do move around and sit next to people who you're not familiar with so that you can exchange ideas after every break, after lunch, whatever the case might be, and of course at lunch itself. A reminder that, and I will pound this floor and I will wave the handkerchief several times, we do want to capture your insights. It's absolutely essential. So please do send me emails. Whether or not you think it's particularly important, we would like to capture that and we'll incorporate your inputs as is essential and as is appropriate. Next slide, thank you. What we are looking at today is in part to improve our understanding of the operational environment. You can see the definition there. What the bottom line is that megacities are increasingly a predominant element of the environment in which we as security forces will operate. It is part of our operational environment, and this conference is designed to help us better understand it. Next slide, thank you. You may hear views that are non-doctrinal. You may hear opinions both during presentations and in responses to the Q&A. Those do not necessarily represent the official policy of the armies, ground self-defense force, or governments that are being represented, but they enrich in our understanding when we can step outside of those constraints, given that we all understand that you may not be hearing what is official policy. As a polite reminder, we have limited time for question and answer, of course, and so I ask that when you ask a question, please keep it to one question, and should you, for some reason, feel the desire to express your opinion, try to hold back on that. We would like the question expressed to give those on the panel maximum time to provide their feedback. You see some reminder bullets down there simply to reemphasize. Next, thank you. All right. It is now my privilege to ask General Brito, the Commanding General of the Maneuver Center of Excellence, to come forward and introduce our keynote speaker. General?
Thank you, Dr. Russell, and good morning, everyone. My name's Major General Gary Brito. I'm here representing our U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command this morning, and also the Commanding General of the Maneuver Center of Excellence at Fort Benning, Georgia. General Brown, General Usasa, honored guest, it is indeed my pleasure to participate and welcome our esteemed guest to the second Megacities Conference. Our theme this year, Current and Future Operations in Megacities, reflects not only the convergence of urban growth and technology, but also the commensurate efforts and aspirations of leaders, both civil and military, to manage the convergence of effects and operations in urban environments. A difficult task indeed. In acknowledgement of these ambitious goals, the collective staff have assembled an amazing depth of international speakers and panelists to include United Nations leaders, Olympic security experts and integrators, and ground force innovators. Prominently, though, our Japan Ground Self-Defense Force hosts have graciously brought their foremost experts to this forum to share their very real world, and hard-earned knowledge. Amongst our guests this morning, General Retired Oriki knows better than most the unique challenges of a complex, modern urban environment, with conditions amplified and often confused by the double-edged sword of modern technology. As Chief of Staff, Japan Joint Staff Office, he led Japan's very first joint operational effort, and he did so in response to the triple earthquake, tsunami, nuclear disaster known as the Great East Japan Earthquake. And today he continues to serve his nation to this day, advising the government of Japan on security, as well as a new space policy. So on behalf of the United States Army Pacific, the Training and Doctrine Command, and our great host, I am indeed very proud to welcome our keynote speaker, General Retired Oriki. Thank you, sir.
Good morning. Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction, Major General Brito. It's an honor for me to be able to speak on this occasion. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'd like to thank the representatives of both Japan and the US forces. It's an honor for me to be here. Since I have to keep my time, let me immediately start with my main subject. The theme today is March 11 Great East Japan Earthquakes Lessons and preparations for earthquakes happening directly under Tokyo. That is the themes that I'd like to speak today. It is 8 years since the Great East Japan Earthquake happened. There was a tsunami disaster and nuclear power accident that never was experienced in the past. That is a complex disaster causing a lot of victims and damages. In particular, at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, still now, many endeavors are taking place despite many difficulties aiming at the decommissioning of a plant. So today I'd like to introduce the activities of Self-Defense Force during the disaster, looking back at the lessons, and I hope these would be helpful in your endeavors for your future approaches. So first, I'd like to talk about the relationship between Self-Defense Force and disaster relief. Self-Defense Force, since its establishment in 1954, amidst the changes of a security environment and political situation in Japan, the role of a self-defense force also has greatly changed. But the role of SDF during the Cold War and post-Cold War era was considered to be important, and through the activities of Self-Defense Force aims at protecting the lives and the properties of the people and always has kept its position of staying close to the people. Because Japan is a country with many natural disasters, and in addition, from the lessons of the Second World War, policy-wise self-defense force was considered to be something that must be close to the people. Even now, the SDF, on a daily basis, is preparing itself for immediate response for disaster relief, and actual cases of disaster relief on average per year is about 500 cases. In the post-war era, not limited only to the SDF, in all military organizations in the world are started to get closely involved to the HADR because probability of conflicts among nations declined, and on the other hand, with abnormal climate, global warming, the frequency and the intensity of natural disasters became more serious, so relief activities of survivors started to be a humanitarian priority. And to respond to that, it is natural that the military organizations organized and self-sufficient ability is something that people are looking forward to. And in case of a major natural disaster, which is a national difficulty, if military personnel wearing combat uniforms conduct their activities earnestly and in an orderly manner in the disaster-affected area, that is important to give a sense of safety to the people. Under such a situation, well, let me introduce the responses and the lessons learned from the Great East Japan earthquake. As you know, the scale was of a magnitude 9.0, maximum seismic intensity 7. This was the largest earthquake on record in Japan, and the disaster-affected area was very wide in range from the northeast part of Japan to Kanto area. The highest tsunami height was 16 meters, causing a devastation in the coastal area, causing many local governments to lose their function, and also there was a nuclear power accident. So that was a complex disaster of earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear accident. And 20,000 people lost their lives as a result or went missing. Under such an unprecedented earthquake disaster, the SDF had to consider the preparations for defense and security that is needed, and in addition to that, taking that into consideration, 107,000 personnel, which is about 50% of the self-defense forces, was sent, which is a maximum in the past. The Joint Task Force was formed for the first time for disaster relief to counter the two fronts of nuclear accident and tsunami. The role of SDF was entirely different from the past disaster relief. The SDF is assumed to play the role of supporting the local governments, but provisionally SDF had to play a central role, like transporting and burying the dead bodies, relief supplies, transportation, control. These are roles that should be played by local governments and other government agencies, but SDF played a part of those roles. At the site of a nuclear power accident, though in a limited situation, for the first time SDF played the role of central coordination of firefighting and police. It was necessary to respond by identifying the detailed needs of survivors and the local governments, and have close cooperation with the local task force, government agencies, and the U.S. Army. So we had to take full consideration of cooperation with the relevant organizations. The content of the activities based on the disasters, we had to search for those who were missing, provide livelihood support, and also provide emergency restoration. In these areas, SDF played a central role. In research and in search and rescue, the SDF rescued about 19,000 people, which is about 70% of all those who were rescued, in transporting relief supplies, including the joint transportation. We formed a transportation scheme, and relief supplies from all over the nation was gathered in a SDF camp and was transported through the Air Self-Defense Force base to the survivors. In the nuclear accident, the Fukushima Daiichi power plant had insufficient cooling capability of our reactors, so for the first time the ground self-defense force used its central NBC defense unit to cool the nuclear reactor and the spent fuel pool. Ground self-defense force helicopters sprayed water, and together with fire department, the police, water was injected using the fire engines of a ground self-defense and the air self-defense forces. And also we conducted decontamination of radioactive substances and monitoring of radiation dosage and reactors temperature, and supported the evacuation of the local residents. In such an extraordinary disaster, in particular for the nuclear reactor itself, in directly responding to such events, different from the U.S. forces that have experts on nuclear aircraft carriers and nuclear submarines. What was required was beyond the SDF abilities. Regardless of the content of a skill, if an earthquake happens directly under Tokyo, there are concerns about the occurrence of extraordinary results. So it is important to gather the forces of all experts and organizations, and that is a national issue. Another important subject for SDF was the joint activity with the U.S. forces. The U.S. forces sent the aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan, and including the newly formed Joint Support Force commander, 16,000 men were sent to deploy the Operation Tomodachi, and this greatly supported the restoration. In supporting the disaster-affected areas, we were very grateful for their responses in a thoughtful manner from a Japanese perspective and the perspective of the survivors. In case of a nuclear accident, experts from NRC came to Japan, and also there were a variety of supports from CBERF, from Washington, D.C. In making coordination of these activities between Japan and the U.S., this followed the coordination mechanism under the Japan-U.S. guidelines. So the Ministry of Defense in Ichigaya and the U.S. Forces Japan Command in Yokota and the Japan-U.S. Component Coordination Center was first organized in the Northeastern Army headquarters of a Joint Task Force Command. So coordination was made, and this led to a smooth and effective support from both Japan and the U.S. I was also almost every day sharing information with the U.S. Forces Japan Command and the Joint Support Forces Commander, and exchanging views almost every day. And whenever necessary, I was also cooperating with the Pacific Commander to share the same understanding in conducting activities by both Japan and the U.S. Close cooperation between Japan and the U.S. recognize again the strength of the ties of the Japan-U.S. alliance, and I think this was also effective as a deterrence to other countries. Japan-U.S. joint coordination mechanism was supposed to start when there was an imminent event. But so that it would be possible to start the necessary coordination smoothly and more rapidly, we felt that this could be considered to be a lesson from this earthquake. And this lesson was included in the 2015 Japan-U.S. Defense Guidelines. In terms of policy and operation, we decided to strengthen coordination from normal times and in emergency times. And as another lesson from this earthquake is that another item was added, which is cooperation in responding to major disasters in Japan. So support from the United States to Japan and participation in the disaster-related exercises of U.S. forces was newly added. So this mechanism was newly added. So from normal days, for normal times, how we can execute such activities is something that was strongly required. At the Great East Japan earthquake, immediately after the earthquake, about 1,200 international relief teams came from 24 countries and 5 international organizations to support search and rescue and medical care. United States and also from Australia, South Korea, Thailand, Israel, forces came to Japan to provide support, and they supported medical activities and transportation personnel and relief supplies. In receiving support from other countries, in Japan, this is supposed to be conducted based on agreements among government agencies and ministries. But this never assumed the acceptance of foreign armed forces. And therefore, at the initial phase, there were multiple phases of contact, and each government agency were taking their own approaches, so this lacked consistency. And ultimately, support forces from other countries, the contact force point for them was unified into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the unit at the Cabinet Office Emergency Headquarters provided requests to the other agencies to receive the support, depending on the type of support. In case of this earthquake, there was immediate decisions required, such as the acceptance of a Chinese forces hospital ship. In future major disasters, it is necessary to have a clear procedure and decision standards at the governmental level on whether foreign armed forces support should be accepted or not. And on this occasion, it is necessary to also study how the Ministry of Defense would be involved. In any event centered on a cabinet office, it is necessary to study as quick as possible what is the organization and the outline to conduct smooth cooperation. Now, in case of earthquake directly under Tokyo, it is assumed that in the future 30 years the probability of occurrence is 70%. In the worst case, the maximum seismic intensity would be 7 and would have about 23,000 victims and 72,000 people requiring rescue and 7.2 million evacuees in 2 weeks and 610,000 buildings lost as a collapse or destroyed by fire. And daytime population of Tokyo is the residents is about let me correct. Daytime, there are people commuting to Tokyo from the surrounding prefectures. So the total daytime population is about 16 million. And the level of damages may be different depending on the time and the season that the disaster will happen. But actually, we should be prepared in terms of crisis management, assuming damages larger than what is assumed in those numbers. At the Kanto earthquake of 1923, there were 100,000 people killed, and 90% of those were killed by fire. In case of earthquake in Tokyo, it is assumed that there could be fires at a maximum in 2,000 locations, and out of 230,000 people killed, which is assumed, it is assumed that 70% would die by fire. Urban centers are modern, but the center is vulnerable against disasters. Not limited only to fires, the disaster would be complex. Just try to imagine there are skyscrapers, expressways, subways, railroads, electricity, gas infrastructure, residential areas, coastal area. So the environment is very complex. If there's any error in the response or any delay, confusion will invite further confusion and which may deteriorate the public safety. In case of earthquake directly under Tokyo, in addition to 110,000 SDF members, it's expected that there will be 14,000 police officers and firefighters, 16,000 mobilized from all over the nation. In total, 350,000 people would be the first responders, including Tokyo and the 3 surrounding prefectures. So, as the first responder, manpower is necessary. In any event, in case of earthquake directly under Tokyo, this is a matter of national emergency because directly related to the capital function and nation's functions and politics and the economy. It is important to protect the people from the damages, and this is also directly linked to the peace and safety of the nation. So as SDF, to save lives come first, but also we must be prepared in terms of defense and security, and also it is important to restore the nation's capital function as quick as possible. This is a priority matter. to respond to the damages. There must be contributions made to the continuity of a public organization's operation. In addition to saving lives, how to allocate the priority duties is important for the SDF. At the Kanto earthquake of 1923, for 2 months, the martial law was placed. So there were limitations placed by the nation. But at the moment, the duty of SDF will not go beyond its position supporting the responses taken by the central government and the Tokyo metropolitan government. But of course, in case of a large disaster like an earthquake under Tokyo, it is necessary as a nation to consider what should be done by preparing legislation related to state of emergency. As for the details, I believe this will be discussed later. Physical obstacles must be eliminated. Human lives must be rescued and searched. There must be support for livelihood, and minimum necessary lifeline infrastructure restoration is essential. And from a broader perspective, in case of a Great East Japan earthquake with the support of U.S. forces, the Sendai Airport restoration was prioritized. As a base for strategic supplies, Narita Airport or other nearby airports and the seaports development must be prioritized. These will be the support base for the disaster-affected areas, and these will facilitate support inside Japan and from other countries. And the survivors are not only Japanese. Recently, there's increase of foreign residents and tourists, which is another important factor. So cooperation with other countries is also important. So we must consider the complex state of a disaster, and the speed of response is essential. Maximum speed is required, and to do that, an integrated disaster response organization as a nation must be developed. Information must be consolidated, integrated, and shared. Under strong command and control of a government, there must be cooperation among relevant government agencies and local governments, and we must integrate the support from other countries, including support from the US. And to realize this, daily training is essential. Of course, there's a limit on the ability of a self-defense force. But I'm sure that SDF will be the core in making the responses, so it is important to secure and maintain manpower as a basics for the activities. As for the future, challenges and recommendations, let me slightly touch upon the subject. The nation level and the Japan-US level, I would like to mainly talk about command and control centered on the command and control of the nation, Japan or US. At the Great East Japan earthquake, in particular, responding to the nuclear accident, the nation's crisis management ability was a subject that was pointed out. And the core of the issue is about command and control. When disaster is larger, the appropriateness of command and control becomes more evident. If command and control is not uniform and is unclear, this will lead to disturbance of everything. This is something that you must keep in mind. At the Great East Japan earthquake, as the Chief of Staff, Joint Staff, for the first time, I had opportunities to report and make my comments directly to the Prime Minister under the attendance of a Defense Minister for a dozen of times about the joint operations with the U.S. forces and operations of SDF. In responding to actual measures, the Chief of Staff, Joint Staff, to report directly and be instructed directly by Prime Minister was never happened before. This was the first time. And at the end of 2013, after the earthquake, the National Security Council was newly established, and the Chief of Staff, Joint Staff, is not an official member, but is always attending the meeting of foreign ministers, including the Prime Minister, to make direct reports and receive instructions. And I think this is the basic situation of a relationship between the government and the military to operate properly under political control. Correct development of a relationship between government and ministry will lead to the protection of the safety and security of the people in case of emergencies and large disasters. At the Ground Self-Defense Force in March last year, the Ground Component Command was newly formed, which will be uniform organizations for the armies under an earthquake in Tokyo. If this happens, this Ground Component Command will be directing the Joint Task Force. Also, we will consider strengthening the function of a Joint Staff Force, not only in case of emergencies, but in case of large disasters, such as disasters happening in Tokyo. Each role of organization will be clearly defined, and the authorities and responsibilities should be clearly and orderly defined. In addition, including government agencies, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, and coordination with the local governments, coordination with the U.S. Army should be defined and make the roles clear. And based on that, it is important for the Ground Self-Defense Force to conduct training on a daily basis based on these standards to respond to the expectations of the people. In case of a large disaster, if this happens directly under Tokyo, at the local level, command and control of units will be similar to the principle of urban warfare. Immediately after a large disaster happens, movement of units going to rescue would be limited and command control would be difficult, so there must be independent activities by smaller units. Authority must be delegated to smaller units who are more familiar with the local situation and give them individual independent capability, so the ability of a commander of a smaller units will become important. So how to quickly organize the decentralized smaller units to respond in a planned manner to disasters is the responsibility of a higher echelon units commander. And lastly, I'd like to talk about the relationship between SDF and command and control of the U.S. forces. Immediately after the Great East Japan earthquake, through the U.S. Forces Japan Command in Yokota, the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps and SDF made coordinations. And at the Fukushima nuclear accident, U.S. forces sent the joint headquarters members under the Pacific Fleet commanders from Hawaii to Yokota and directly commanded the operations. Ever since the Japan-US alliance was signed, it was the first case that the U.S. forces conducted their operations by opening a joint headquarters in Japan. In a sense, this might be the limit of the operations that U.S. Forces Japan Command can conduct, not limited only to HADR, but in case of emergencies, the uniformation of U.S. forces, I understand, is very flexible. So considering this, for the self-defense force and U.S. forces, the relationship must be defined. For both SDF and U.S. forces, in case of emergency or HADR, on a daily basis, it is important to know who is the counterpart and who is the commander. Human relations is an important element. Well, last but not the least, for these 2 days, we are going to discuss about the megacities, present and future operations. This is a very interesting subject. Through this occasion, I hope this will be a very important occasion for military organizations with the duty of securing the safety and security of their people in the future to share experience and knowledge. I would be very happy if my speech would be of any information for your discussions. At the Great East Japan earthquake, at that time, well, I'd like to hear later the story of your experience at the Great Japan earthquake, and please correct if I said something wrong. Thank you very much for giving your time today. For both armies of both countries to gather, to exchange their views, to have so many people gathered, and to see this gathering for the first time, I felt very encouraged and like to continue with the efforts between the two countries, and I hope the two organizations' ties will be further strengthened in the future under your leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, General Oriki. Certainly, if there was any doubt in anyone's mind about the importance of partnership in responding to disasters, and disasters in particular in megacities, that has now been laid to rest thanks to our keynote speaker's comments. There was another important point that I want to make sure nobody missed there, and that is what we are going to discuss over the next 2 days. Although we focus on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, we are also learning much regardless of what the cause of the disaster is. It might well be a natural disaster. It could be because of an act of terrorism, as was alluded to and will be addressed directly by Dr. Okamura, who follows me. But also, of course, as General Oriki mentioned, it could also be the result of a combat situation. We need to realize, too, that while we are using Tokyo as our exemplar, as the largest megacity in the world, and that, I would argue, in so many ways, is the most prepared for a disaster, that chances are very good that our militaries will be committed elsewhere to other megacities around the world in developing nations that may be far less prepared than is Tokyo, than is Japan, to deal with these disasters. And we need to take all the comments and all of our questions in that context as well throughout the next 2 days. Next slide, thank you. It falls to me to lay another foundation stone. After our keynote speaker launched us so successfully, this first session is going to look at further establishing context and a historical basis for the remainder of the 2 days. Currently, as of the end of 2018, there are 38 megacities in the world, taking the common and popular definition of an urban area of over 10 million individuals, the most recent addition being Bogota, Colombia. 22 of those, as you see in this slide, are in the East Asia, Indo-Pacific area. Next slide, thank you. What is the magnitude of the challenge that we have to deal with? Well, for recent contingencies involving our militaries, you can see that the Tokyo megacity itself has almost the same population as that of the entire country of Iraq. And it well exceeds that in Afghanistan. As far as its expanse, it is some 5 times greater than the size of Oahu, which is where the headquarters for United States Army Pacific lies. But the traffic is just as bad. Looking at the megacity that we focused on last year, New York, in its population, which is far less than that for the megacity in which we now sit, there are still some 800 languages that are spoken, and only just over half of the population speaks English exclusively in the home. Another challenge when you consider a military deploying into a megacity around the world and having to communicate with the multiple authorities that are in that megacity, because we know that these cities can contain tens, if not hundreds, of individual authorities rather than one centralized. And yet, too, there's opportunity there. Because if you have multiple languages spoken, chances are pretty good that you've got individuals who speak your language and that might well be able to communicate with you and provide you information and intelligence in languages that otherwise would be inaccessible to you, but they can act as a translator of sorts. Also, too, using Tokyo as an example to return to where we are today, realize that if you've got a population of some 38 million, then you have twice that number of eyes and ears, for all intents and purposes, that can provide you knowledge far better than that of an outsider who has not lived in that megacity, be it Tokyo, Bangkok, Jakarta, or another around the world. Next slide, thank you. Now, let me step out of the common definition, and this is not a doctrinal definition, but I offer that the definition of 10 million for a megacity is not particularly helpful from an operational perspective. A city of 9 million, an urban area of 11 million, certainly does not differ significantly from one of 10 million. An urban area of 10 million does differ significantly from Tokyo or Jakarta or New York or Los Angeles or Bangkok. So rather than defining it simply in terms of population, I would offer that we need to consider megacities in terms of not only massive population size and great geographical spread, but also complexity, interconnectedness, and the influence that these urban areas demonstrate. For example, a megacity, according to this definition, would have to not only be interconnected with and have influence in the immediate surrounding rural area, but certainly the country of which it is a part, the super region that includes countries in the immediate vicinity, and very likely worldwide as well. Now, with that definition, some of the 22 megacities in the Indo-Pacific area, some of those 38 around the world, would not qualify as megacities despite their population size. You saw that there are 6 cities of over 10 million, urban areas of over 10 million in China. I would offer that some of those, and some of the others around the world, do not have the interconnectedness, do not have influence super-regionally or worldwide, and therefore, again, focusing on the operational consequences that we in the military and governments need to focus on, they do not qualify as megacities. On the other hand, there are cities that may have far less than 10 million. And I use Singapore as an example, as you see there. Even with the extended portion of that urban area that includes urban areas in Malaysia and Indonesia, the population is roughly 6 million. And yet you can see just how consequential a disaster would be in Singapore, how much it would disrupt not only economic factors, but also transportation factors, in particular maritime. So here we have an example of an urban area far less than 10 million, but one that if we had to operate in, just as in any other megacity, given our definition at the top of the slide, we have to be concerned not only with the immediate area and humanitarian relief or assistance for the citizenry, but what are the consequences of our decisions? What are the consequences of our actions as they impact the rest of the country, that super region, and very likely the world? Next slide, please. I want to conclude with 3 slides, because I would offer that the factors that best make a megacity able to deal with a disaster deal with the partnership that was so emphasized by General Oriki. Back in the late 1940s and early 1950s, during the Hukbalahap rebellion in the Philippines, 2 officers were working together, one American and one Filipino. They wrote a very good book that included this diagram at the conclusion of their experiences. Quite simply, they showed that a government has to have various lines of effort or lines of operations. And in this case, you can see what those 4 are. Next slide, thank you. Fast forward then to the early part of the 21st century in Iraq, and we in the United States adopted that particular description as you see here. Now, the lines of operations, the lines of effort, they might be 4, they might be 6, they might be more, they might be fewer. They might be the 4 you see here, they might be others. But I will offer that while there are great insights offered by those 2 gentlemen in the Philippines and by our own Army in the early portions of the 21st century, what we have here is the perfect diagram of stovepiped operations. And if we have operations where everybody is operating in their own comfort zone, we are not going to be successful if we are trying to reply, if we're trying to address, if we're trying to solve the challenges that are going to be involved in HADR or any kind of operation that includes HADR in a megacity. Final slide, please. So I would offer that what we have instead is a diagram as shown here. Again, the number of braids in our rope can be more or less than 4. I use 4 demonstrably. Understand that each one of those braids has many, many fibers within it. Note too that the braids are of different size, representing what we need to have as a priority as a given point in time. And we have 2 time scales here. One goes across the bottom, one from top to bottom with increasing time. We know that a rope is valuable because the braids are far stronger together than are they individually. We have a synergistic effect. If we have organizations that plan together, exercise together, rehearse together, then instead of starting here, where we have very loose braids that don't have that increased strength, we could be starting down here someplace where we've already tightened those braids considerably. In too many cases, megacities and governments do not emphasize that need to cooperate, that need to prepare together. And so we spend a lot of time when the disaster has already struck trying to bring those together. Note too, if you will, that is going to be complex as we do our preparations. It may be that early on security is going to be the primary emphasis, and so maybe the military will be in charge, as might be the case if it was a wartime consequence instead of one that was a result of a natural disaster or an act of terrorism. As time moves on, though, the emphasis might go to, the priority might go to essential services or economic development. Those sorts of transitions may mean that we have a leadership change. Those sorts of transitions will be very difficult, and they'll be all the more difficult in a time of disaster if we've not had courses of action, and again, plan for them, rehearse them, and exercise them. So one of the great benefits of our 2 days is that we do have representatives from various nations, from various organizations, from non-traditional coalition partners such as the UN. Hopefully by the end of this 2 days, we will have established relationships that will help us not to be dealing in stovepipes any longer, but rather is dealing with tightly braided elements of that rope. Thank you very much.